Preparing for this night was very good for me. Okay, all right. Especially to listen to in the podcast the hero of some of my friends, because I heard his name utilized because of the impact that they had on them. And I thought, well, they are really good friends. He must be a good guy. And I think that this has been a very needed kind of exercise of thinking things through integrally. Because when we talk about our own understanding of the scriptures, sometimes I do not understand what people do with the scriptures. They'll say something about it and then in the very next breath deny it. And the fact that, you know, our bodies are made out of the dust of the ground and the breath of life has been breathed into us, then what happens the next step? You know, where do we go from there? Our Haudenosaunee people referred to future generations as faces coming from the ground, which metaphorically is exactly what Genesis was talking about. The body was squeezed together from the earth. And even the idea that we spoke of the earth as mother. And I know that the patriarchal systems really kind of, they get all, I said this one time, I said, you know, all you Protestants and Western Christians have learned how to hold it all in and be just, you know, stiff and non-responsive. But I said, you know, when things like Mother Earth get said, you are like this on the inside. Your brain is going tilt. And I observe that often. I see what's going on. But the idea for, like my uncle, we had Mennonites visit my uncle, Arnold Jacobs, who had a studio on Highway 54 on the reserve. And he is a traditional person. I grew up in the traditional way for 20 years of my life. Didn't come to Christian faith until I was 20. And I had to relearn how to be indigenous and Christian. I had to relearn that because I was led away in another direction. I was led away into this divorcing of physicality with spirituality, which is at the heart of the gospel story. It's right there. I mean, it's the resurrection of what? The physical body of Christ. And if you don't live in embodied faith, then I don't know what you've got. You've just got something very strange to me and quite cultic in that sense of disconnection from the origins and the beginning. And so my uncle was describing this picture of the creation story, the Haudenosaunee creation story. And you know, a creation story is a grand story to try to explain why things are as they are. And so, you know, there are many creation stories. Different people have creation stories. And, you know, when I mention this to Christian audiences, that, you know, they just stiffen up inside and say, oh, there's just one Christian, that's just Genesis, and there's nothing else that can be. And I just say, chill out, because a creation story is a grand story of a people trying to explain why things are the way they are. And if you can chill out and just accept it that way, you can see what the Bible is doing as well. It's trying to explain things and why things are as they are. And so he's showing this beautiful picture that he painted of the sky world and Turtle Island and all of that. And he refers to the earth as mother, and he says, And he just stopped there, and he was speaking to Mennonites, so he must have understood a little bit of Mennonite concerns, I guess theological concerns, Mother Earth and, the idea of femininity. And he says, mother is a metaphor. So my uncle, who's a traditional chief, was trying to teach some Europeans about what metaphor means. He gave a grammar lesson, a definition of a word so that you could understand what we're talking about. And so just that idea, if their face is coming from the ground, of course it's sacred. And we're not talking about an ideal. We're talking about the dirt outside of this place. We're talking about the dish with one spoon. That's where our faces have come from. That's where our being, our physicality has come from. And it's come from our Mother, the Earth. She has provided for us everything that we could possibly need in this life. Everything comes from the earth. And of course it's sacred. That's real. That's not just an idea, that is the reality. Not even just metaphor, it is the physicality of reality too. And so when I hear Willie talking about, different Christian perspectives, I understand that because I was oriented to that in my early Christian life as well. But it disconnected me from this earth. It disconnected me from my family. It disconnected me from my community. And I didn't like that. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be disconnected from my own family. And yet some of you are just totally happy to be that way. And I don't understand that. And I think if you get connected to your own physicality, your own spiritual understanding, and your own connection with the Creator and this earth, connection matters. And it's not just something that you can just sweep away. So I just really, really appreciate that because in the objectifying of the land to a thing, you've lost your opportunity to even have something to say in your understanding as a Christian about it. Because if you don't have anything connected to it and it's just a thing, then it's no different than whatever anybody else may say about it. And I don't know about you, but I understand myself as a created being. I have a connection to the Creator. I have a connection to this earth. I have connection to my family. And I've come to Christian understanding of what Jesus did to restore things and bring them back. Colossians talks about the fact that all things in Him consist. They're held together. Life is held together. Physicality, spirituality, your mental state, your mind, your emotions, your will, your community, your people, the food that you eat, all of that is connected. And to be disconnected from that is very strange to me. I don't think AI is human intelligence. It may be artificial logic, but it is not human intelligence because human intelligence has this perspective of feeling and connection and understanding and culture and history that's connected to that knowledge. It's not just a piece of information. It is a part of who we are as human beings. So thank you for speaking to us tonight.
"10 minutes, not more. Shorter than a sermon, and I'm an Anglican, so that's really short. So I want to say how meaningful it is for me to have the opportunity to respond to Dr. Jennings and to do so alongside my friend Adrian Jacobs, because both Adrian and Willie are woven into my own story of the land and actually pretty significant ways, and I want to identify some of those ways. They've been a part of my awakening to the necessity of a theology of land and the unfinished work of unburdening myself of the property paradigm. Now, by property paradigm, and I think this might align with where Willie was going, is that layer of abstraction that keeps us from actually touching the ground. It's a view of land that privileges, as a matter of principle, owning over inhabiting, securing over sharing, and having over holding. In 2016, I witnessed and participated in the transformation, indeed I would say the transfiguration, of a 7,000 square foot piece of privately owned land in my neighborhood of Parkdale, Toronto. This little piece of land, which happens to sit immediately behind the church where I have been serving for many years, is now called the Milky Way Garden. It had become the first acquisition of a brand new urban community land trust. This community-led organization was able to raise the funds to purchase the land off of the private market and transfer it to community ownership. While this was not a total exit from the private property regime, this real estate transaction nonetheless represented something new. It made use of an existing property relation, namely ownership, in order to point to a relation beyond property. In this real estate transaction, an existing property relation was used in order to point to a relation beyond property. This land, we might say, was turned into a commons. It was decommodified and thereby unburdened of some of the weight of property. In being permanently removed from the private market, this land, as a commodity, decreased in financial value. But this loss was more than compensated for in the surplus of ecological, social, and spiritual connection that has flourished there ever since. This land became a bustling site of urban agriculture, of neighborhood gatherings, of community organizing, of indigenous ceremony, of Buddhist ritual, and even the occasional Christian Eucharist. To be unburdened of property, it turns out, is an extraordinary and potentially transfigurative thing, both for the land and for us. Now, what I was experiencing at the community level was also being substantiated at the theological level, because it was during this time that I discovered Dr. Jennings' book, the one that Tim already mentioned, The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race. I was taken especially by those sections of the book that unapologetically diagnosed the pathology in the colonial Christian vision of dividing bodies from land and transforming inhabited places into abstract, commodified parcels of property. It felt to me like something new was happening, something on the ground with the land and something in the air. A new theological wind seemed to be blowing through the church. And the timing seemed just right, as a massive wave of property transition was looming for the church in North America. The church, so I thought, just needed a clear articulation of a theological framework that would help us to see that we were not, in fact, beholden to the property paradigm, that our land and building problem was actually an opportunity, that a sector-wide transformation was possible, something like a land-based revival movement. It was while I was caught up in this optimism that I got to know Adrian. Adrian had, of course, been here all along. Not only were his people here long before my people arrived, but he had already been calling the church to land-based reconciliation. Adrian had been urging and inviting settler congregations to honor the treaty relationships that have governed this land for generations. And he even provided a concrete tool for doing so, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about Adrian's spiritual covenant between indigenous communities and churches. So the transformation of the Milky Way Garden that I was talking about into a commons was an innovation in one respect, but in another, it was really just a return to the spirit of the treaties. Treaties like the one Adrian named, which just governs the land that we're on right now, the dish with one spoon that calls us not to own, but to share and care for the land. So it was Adrian who helped me to realize that any theology of land had to be local and concrete. To recognize this land, the land where our feet might be planted if we were outside, was the place to start, not up in the stratosphere of theological reflection. So between Adrian's actionable model of spiritual covenants and Willie's prophetic call for the church to leave behind our colonial fleshpots of property, there seemed to be a path emerging that would enable the settler church to use our land to unbind ourselves from the old colonial regimes of ownership, to rebind ourselves to treaty relationship, to release ourselves and the land itself from the bondage to property. It seemed like an opportune moment, where all at once we could respond to the affordability and displacement crisis in our neighborhoods, reintegrate our congregations into communities, balance our budgets, and take concrete steps toward reparation and reconciliation with indigenous communities. The church as an institution seemed to be going down, but in this respect, things were looking up. I'm a little less optimistic now. I know that there are some amazing stories out there about churches leveraging their land assets to impact their communities for good, and we're going to hear some of those stories tomorrow. But these transformations have been more ad hoc than sector-wide. I think churches are becoming more strategic with their real estate, but they seem to still remain beholden to the property paradigm, leveraging more than releasing, monetizing more than sharing, repurposing more than returning. Transitioning land into community ownership or transferring land back to indigenous communities, if these are seen as possibilities at all, they are considered only the most radical ones. They strike us as being financially irresponsible, examples of poor stewardship. But I think that's the property talking. It definitely doesn't resonate with the psalmist affirmation that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. I'll conclude by saying this. I believe the church still has the opportunity to free itself of the burden of property and rise to the occasion that we are confronted with. But if we aren't prepared to rise to the occasion, maybe we have an opportunity to sink to it. The so-called decline of the church in North America may better be conceived of as a descent, a downward, earthward movement that although usually perceived as failure, may in fact be a movement of the Spirit, a reconnection with the land in a different way. If we stopped grasping to save our decaying institutions and started grieving instead, what might happen? The word grief, after all, comes from the same root as gravity. It is a force that pulls us toward the land, toward the dirt, toward humility, which is a word that also means dirt. Maybe if we can't unburden ourselves enough to build up, we can enter into what Francis Weller calls an apprenticeship with grief and graciously go down. Because down there, with the bodies of the ancestors, the abandoned dreams, the ancient remnants of trees and animals, we might find the resources we need. We might even become the resources the church needs. Compost for the next generation. Maybe the church should be the wheat that bears its fruit in dying. Thank you.